21. Black R&B legends who hid their disabled children until the end of their lives. What if I told you that behind the glamour fame and platinum records, some of R&B's greatest legends were hiding heartbreaking secrets? These icons, whose voices shaped generations, carried silent battles. No stage could reveal disabled children whose struggles were kept away from the public eye until the very end of their lives. From Toni Braxton to Ray Charles, from James Brown to Marvin Gaye. Their private pain was far deeper than any lyric they ever sang. Are you ready to uncover the truths they never wanted the world to see? Stay tuned and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence. Toni Braxton. Toni Braxton, one of the most successful female R&B artists of the 1990s and early 2000s, appeared to have it all: platinum albums, Grammy Awards, and sold-out residencies in Las Vegas. But behind the stage lights and her legendary ballads like Unbreak My Heart, she was fighting a private battle that few fans knew about. In 2007, her younger son Diesel was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at just 3 years old. The news devastated Toni. She had been performing nightly in a multi-million-dollar Vegas residency, yet at home she felt powerless as her little boy struggled to make eye contact, avoided hugs, and remained silent when she longed to hear him say, "Mom." Braxton has often spoken about how she initially blamed herself. In a deeply emotional interview, she confessed that she once believed her son's condition was God's punishment for an abortion she had earlier in her life. This confession drew both criticism and sympathy, but more importantly, it revealed the raw anguish of a mother grasping for answers where none existed. Instead of hiding, Toni chose to transform her pain into action. She pulled back from performing and committed herself fully to early interventions therapy programs and research on autism treatment. Some reports noted that she even sold a home to afford access to highly regarded speech therapists and behavioral specialists. In time, Diesel discovered a gift painting. Though his words were limited, his canvases spoke volumes filled with color and movement. Toni wept when she first saw his work, realizing that her son did not need to be cured to be understood. From that moment, she became one of the most visible advocates for autism awareness in the entertainment industry. She partnered with organizations such as Autism Speaks, produced documentaries to spread awareness, and used her fame to raise millions of dollars for research and family support programs. Do you think celebrities should speak openly about such personal struggles? Or is it better for them to keep their private lives away from the spotlight? What makes Toni's story powerful is not only her son's progress, but her own transformation. She shifted from being an R&B diva into a mother who carried her platform into advocacy, showing that fame means little if it cannot be used to help others. Today, Toni Braxton continues to balance music with activism, proving that true legacy is built not just on awards, but on the strength to fight for those you love the most. Ray Charles. Ray Charles, often called the genius, was celebrated for his ability to turn personal hardship into timeless music. Blind since childhood, he redefined American music with classics like Georgia on My Mind and Hit the Road Jack. Yet behind the brilliance, he carried an unspoken sorrow connected to his son David, who endured a devastating tragedy in 1968. At the time, David was a teenager who shared his father's passion for music and had begun learning piano. But a car accident left him paralyzed, confining him to a wheelchair and altering the trajectory of his life forever. For Ray, who had already survived the loss of his sight and the early death of his mother, this was the wound that never healed. Friends and studio engineers recalled how during recording sessions, Ray would sometimes stop playing, bury his head against the piano, and cry silently. To the outside world, his career soared. He won Grammy Awards, sold millions of records, and became a symbol of resilience for the Black community. But in private, he admitted to feeling powerless, unable to protect his own child from pain. David's attempts to continue music were bittersweet. His hands trembled at the keys, and though he could play a few pieces, chronic pain made progress difficult. Ray quietly remodeled his home so David could move freely in a wheelchair, and even installed a piano in his room, hoping that music could offer comfort. Few people know that Charles also paid for an entire rehabilitation hospital anonymously, a gesture born from the guilt of knowing his fame and fortune could not restore his son's mobility. After the accident, subtle changes appeared in Ray's songs. Listeners noticed longer pauses in his melodies, as though he was holding on to something already gone. Tracks like Drown in My Own Tears carried new weight not just as performances, but as confessions. His love songs became quieter, emptier, yet more profound, echoing the heart of a father who could not save his child. Ray Charles will always be remembered as the blind genius who reshaped music. But for those who look closer, his story also reveals the heartbreaking truth that even legends cannot escape the vulnerabilities of parenthood. His genius was real, but so was his grief. James Brown. James Brown, the godfather of soul, was known for his explosive stage presence, shouts, footwork, and rhythms that seemed to burn through the floor. But much of that fire was fueled by a pain he rarely spoke about: the suffering of his son Terry. Unlike his father, Terry did not inherit a life of fame and music. Instead, he worked in a factory, a job James never wanted for him but could not intervene in soon enough. One tragic day, a workplace accident cost Terry his leg. For a man who built his career on rhythm dance and movement, the news hit James harder than any blow he had ever taken in life. Witnesses recalled that James disappeared for 3 days after hearing the news, shutting himself off from the world. When he returned, his usual bravado was replaced with an undercurrent of guilt. He confessed privately that he should have pulled his son out of that factory long before the accident happened. Though he provided the best medical care available, even ordering a state-of-the-art prosthetic limb from Germany and building a custom-designed house for Terry James could never shake the belief that he had failed his child. His way of coping was to throw himself even deeper into his performances. Every scream, every shuffle, every sweat-drenched spin on stage was not just for the audience, it was an outlet for a father's anguish. Those who paid close attention could hear it in his voice when he sang "I Got This Feeling." The raw edge in his tone was less about thrilling the crowd and more about screaming from within. In response to Terry's suffering, James also turned to philanthropy. He created a fund to support families of workers injured in industrial accidents, quietly pouring money into causes that echoed his son's tragedy. Still, no amount of charity eased the pain he carried when he looked at Terry and saw the cost of his absence. On stage, James Brown looked unstoppable, a machine of funk and fury. But off stage, he was a father who danced not only to entertain the world, but to keep himself from drowning in grief. Barry White. Barry White's deep, velvety voice made him the soundtrack of romance in the 1970s with hits like "Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe" and "You're the First, the Last, My Everything." To the world, he was the king of seduction, a man whose love songs promised warmth and passion. Yet behind that magnetic persona, Barry lived through a nightmare that stripped away the glamour of fame, the battle for his daughter Denise's life. At just 12 years old, Denise was diagnosed with acute leukemia, a disease that not only weakened her body, but also robbed her of her childhood. When Barry first heard the diagnosis, he was in the middle of a European tour. He canceled every performance, choosing instead to sit in a hard plastic chair beside his daughter's hospital bed. Fans may have wondered about his sudden absence, but Barry wasn't concerned with charts or ticket sales. His only audience was a fragile child fighting for survival. During long nights, he scribbled melodies into notebooks, admitting later that songwriting was the only thing that kept him from collapsing. The chemotherapy was brutal. Denise lost her hair, her energy, and even much of her hearing after one particularly harsh round of treatment. For Barry, a man who had built his life around sound, this was devastating. "She loves music, and now she can't hear it fully," he once whispered to a close friend. In a desperate attempt to reclaim control, he quit his decades-long smoking habit, determined to fight back in whatever way he could. Denise eventually survived her battle with cancer, though she never pursued music as a career. Instead, She became an advocate for children with cancer, traveling across the United States to share her testimony of resilience. Barry often said she had turned her scars into armor, a strength that inspired him long after the hospital days were over. His later albums reflected this transformation, less about seduction, more about intimacy and survival. Songs like "Practice What You Preach" carried a weight far beyond romance. They revealed the heart of a father who had lived through agony and come out determined never to quit. Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder's genius made him more than a musician. He was a cultural force. From Superstition to Lately, his songs captured love, joy, and social struggle with unmatched brilliance. Yet even a man celebrated as a prodigy of sound faced a heartbreak no melody could soothe: the devastating accident of his son Mumus. Unlike the tragic car crashes or dramatic illnesses that often strike celebrities' families, this calamity was almost mundane, a slip on the stairs at home. That fall, however, changed everything. Mumus, only a teenager at the time, was left a quadriplegic, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. For Stevie, who had already overcome blindness and built his career on resilience, the helplessness was unbearable. He had always turned pain into music, but this time the wound was too deep. Quietly, he remodeled his home to accommodate medical equipment and specialists, ensuring Mumus could live with dignity and comfort. Friends noted that Stevie did not drown the house in melodies or use his songs as therapy. Instead, he relied on silence, presence, and patience because no chord could undo the injury. What many people don't know is that Mumus found his own voice, not in music, but in writing. Despite his physical limitations, he began crafting poetry and prose works, praised for their raw honesty and depth. Stevie kept every draft as a treasure, cherishing the inked pages as much as he once cherished his own gold records. Those close to him say that these writings gave Stevie something profound, a way to understand his son's world beyond the limits of disability. The accident also shifted Stevie's music in subtle but undeniable ways. In the early 1990s, his songs became more somber, his grooves slower, and his performances less playful. Fans who had once seen him bounce with energy on stage now witnessed a more reflective presence, a man weighed down by life yet still determined to share love through art. Stevie Wonder will forever be remembered as one of music's greatest geniuses, but his story as a father quietly supporting a son who transformed pain into poetry reminds us that even legends are most powerful when their love is unconditional. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye, often hailed as the Prince of Soul, gave the world timeless masterpieces like What's Going On and Let's Get It On. His voice carried both sensuality and social commentary, bridging church hymns and protest anthems. But behind his iconic sound was a father silently crushed by a family tragedy. One winter night, a malfunction in his home's old heating system triggered a fire. Though small, the smoke was enough to cause severe brain damage to his young son, Frankie. Marvin had meant to repair the heater but kept postponing it, an ordinary delay that turned into a lifetime of guilt. Frankie survived, but was never the same. Once a lively, sharp boy, he now struggled with cognitive impairments. He often confused day with night, and even saying dad became inconsistent. For Marvin, the guilt was unbearable. He believed that one moment of neglect had stolen his son's future. Family members recalled how Marvin became increasingly withdrawn after the incident. While his public appearances were fewer, his time in the studio became longer. But instead of hits, he poured his sorrow into ballads filled with whispered confessions and subtle, almost hidden cries of pain. Frankie eventually found a way to communicate through art, painting colorful canvases that expressed what words could not. Marvin treasured these paintings, hanging them on the walls of his studio. Each stroke of paint was both a reminder of loss and a spark of hope. He often said Frankie's art allowed him to feel music in colors, as though his son was speaking in another language only the two of them understood. Marvin's later works carried a haunting undertone. His bass lines often sounded hollow, his whispers more fragile, his melodies tinged with regret. Fans noticed the shift but rarely understood its source. For Marvin, every note was an apology, every lyric a prayer for forgiveness for not fixing that heater in time. Though remembered as a man of passion style and brilliance, Marvin Gaye was also a father who lived with an invisible wound. His greatest songs might have topped charts, but his quietest moments staring at his son's paintings revealed where his soul truly dwelled. Al Green. Al Green's silky falsetto and gospel-infused soul made him one of the most beloved R&B voices of the 1970s. Songs like Let's Stay Together and Love and Happiness gave him a reputation as the preacher of romance, a man whose music seemed to carry joy and devotion. But in private, Al faced a heartache that reshaped both his career and his faith: his daughter Cora's battle with lupus. Diagnosed at just 10 years old, Cora's illness struck without warning, manifesting in crippling fatigue, painful joint inflammation, and constant fear of complications. For Al, it was a devastating reminder that even a voice praised around the world could not sing away a child's suffering. At the time, Al was at the height of his career, but he abruptly scaled back his tours. He sold one of his homes to fund a private dialysis room for Cora, determined to give her the best care possible. Every morning, instead of rehearsing for performances, he sat at her bedside with a Bible, whispering prayers and reading verses aloud. His voice, once a beacon for millions, became softer, more fragile, reserved for comforting his daughter through long nights filled with pain. Cora's condition forced Al to live in constant vigilance. Simple coughs or fevers could become life-threatening. Still, Cora found strength in gospel music. Though she never became a mainstream star, she sang in her local church choir, earning the nickname Daughter of Faith. For her gospel wasn't just music, it was survival, a way to reclaim joy even when her body betrayed her. The experience changed Al's artistry. His recordings after Cora's diagnosis shifted from playful declarations of love to songs layered with vulnerability and raw emotion. Friends and fans noticed a deeper ache in his voice, as if every lyric carried the weight of a father's unspoken fears. Al Green may be remembered as the man who brought soul music to its spiritual peak, but his truest devotion was shown not on stage, but at home, where he became less of a superstar and more of a steadfast father, clinging to faith while watching his daughter endure the unendurable. Rick James. Rick James, the flamboyant super freak of funk, built his career on excess wild outfits, roaring guitars, and lyrics that celebrated rebellion. Yet behind the bravado was a man marked by tragedy, one that silenced even his loudest songs. The accident that left his son Trey paralyzed. Trey was a teenager with his own musical dreams, heading home from practice when a drunk driver struck him. The crash left him paralyzed from the chest down, his youthful energy suddenly trapped in a still body. For Rick, who had always preached freedom and living big, the irony was unbearable. Friends recalled that after the accident, Rick disappeared into himself. He shut his studio doors, locked away his instruments, and for months did not record a single note. Rumors spread that he burned entire tapes of unreleased material, declaring that music had betrayed him. For a man who had always found escape in sound, the silence was louder than anything he had ever played. Yet in time, Trey showed a resilience that stunned even his father. Though confined to a wheelchair, he began experimenting with music production. With one functional hand, he crafted beats, raw, electronic, sharp-edged sounds that defied his physical limitations. Rick would sit quietly as Trey played his work, nodding in approval, but rarely speaking. Trey later described those nods as the purest expression of pride he ever saw in his father. Rick's own music changed after Trey's accident. Gone was the swaggering funk that defined his earlier career. Instead, his songs grew darker, heavy with sorrow and reflection. Tracks that once celebrated excess now felt like laments, carrying the weight of a man who had lost more than fame could ever restore. Even Give It To Me Baby, when revisited, sounded less like a party anthem and more like a cry for something irretrievable. Rick James remains etched in history as a rebel, a pioneer of funk rock and a cultural firebrand. But the truest measure of his humanity came not in his stage antics, but in the quiet hours spent beside his son, listening, nodding, and learning that pride and love could survive even in the darkest silence. Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes, the bald-headed soul icon draped in chains, redefined 1970s R&B with his deep baritone and cinematic arrangements. His soundtrack for Shaft won him both an Academy Award and a permanent place in pop culture. To fans, Hayes was untouchable, stylish, commanding, and larger than life. But away from the spotlight, he was simply a father shattered by the cruel twist of fate that stole his daughter Felicia's sight. Felicia had been a bright, lively child, often sitting at the piano with her father, mimicking his chords by ear. Then came the diagnosis, and aggressive cancer silently eroding her vision. By the time doctors discovered it, one eye required removal, and the other retained only a faint trace of light. Overnight, the vibrant child who used to read sheet music and chase after her siblings was left tracing her hand along the walls just to find the kitchen. For Isaac, the guilt was crushing. He questioned everything: his busy touring schedule, the healthcare system, even his own diet. He spent nights in the studio playing lonely piano melodies while tears slid down his face, asking why he hadn't noticed the signs sooner. Yet Felicia refused to fade into silence. She taught herself to play the organ by touch, memorizing the spacing of keys and recalling melodies after hearing them only once. People who visited the Hayes home said she possessed an almost supernatural gift, replaying entire songs with precision. For Isaac, that resilience became both humbling and inspiring. He often told friends that her blindness had sharpened his own vision of what truly mattered. In response to her struggle, Isaac shifted his focus. His once glamorous public persona gave way to quieter work, supporting music programs for children with disabilities and funding initiatives that gave blind students access to instruments. His own recordings grew more introspective, less about seduction, and more about survival. To audiences, he remained the velvet-voiced giant of soul. But to those who looked closer, Isaac Hayes was something even greater, a father who turned his pain into a mission and who learned from his daughter that true genius isn't in seeing, but in never giving up on being heard. Chaka Khan. Chaka Khan. The queen of funk dazzled the world with her powerful vocals on hits like "I'm Every Woman and Ain't Nobody." She was the embodiment of energy and resilience, striding across stages with unmatched charisma. But behind the spotlight, Chaka's greatest performance was not for her fans, it was for her son Damien, who battled life-altering seizures after a childhood accident. What seemed at first to be a harmless fall on the playground spiraled into a medical crisis when weeks later, Damien suffered his first seizure. From that moment on, their lives were defined by unpredictability and fear. Chaka's once lively home turned into what friends described as a small medical center. Surveillance cameras were installed, medication charts lined the walls, and emergency equipment was kept within reach at all times. Instead of rehearsing for tours or recording sessions, she spent sleepless nights at her son's bedside, clutching his hand through convulsions and praying he would wake. When interviewers asked why her career had slowed during certain years, Chaka would smile politely, rarely revealing the weight she carried as a mother. She later admitted that her music shifted because of Damien's illness. The sweet, flirtatious tones of her early career gave way to something fiercer. Her later albums carried the roar of a lioness protecting her cub. Insiders whispered that she recorded an entire unreleased album dedicated solely to Damien's songs she played only when he regained consciousness after a seizure, as if reminding him that music was waiting for his return. Chaka's sacrifice cost her years of momentum in the music industry, yet it also deepened her artistry. Her lyrics grew heavier, her delivery more urgent, reflecting a woman who had seen pain up close and refused to let it silence her. In private, she was not the queen of funk, but a warrior mother battling a relentless condition that stole ordinary joys from her child. For fans who admired her stage strength, the truth is even more inspiring. Chaka Khan's greatest legacy may not be the record she sold, but the unconditional love she showed while standing guard over her son's fragile life. Eddie Levert. Eddie Levert, the unmistakable voice behind the O'Jays classics like Love Train and Backstabbers, spent decades filling arenas with songs about community and devotion. Yet at the height of his fame, he faced a private struggle that no hit record could soften the fight to save his daughter Ryan's life. When Ryan was just 8 years old, she began experiencing alarming symptoms, constant fatigue, shortness of breath, and episodes of faintness. Doctors eventually diagnosed her with a rare congenital heart condition, one that required surgery if she was to survive. The revelation stopped Eddie cold. Known for his tireless touring schedule, he canceled performances without hesitation. At a press conference, he simply said, "Family first," and walked away from the microphone. For the next 2 years, he wasn't an R&B superstar. He was a full-time father, memorizing medication schedules, learning to read ECG charts, and standing guard during countless hospital visits. His wife later said that Eddie often slept upright in hospital chairs, holding Ryan's hand through long nights of uncertainty. Ryan's surgery eventually saved her life, but it came with sacrifices. She was no longer able to pursue sports or the stage career she once dreamed of. Instead, she turned her creativity toward design, developing haunting artworks that incorporated visual representations of heartbeats, as if each piece was a translation of her lived experience. Eddie often shared that her resilience gave him a new outlook on life and artistry. Though Eddie did return to music, his work was never the same. The once vibrant funk of the O'Jays evolved into softer ballads and reflective lyrics, layered with gratitude and vulnerability. He often referred to Ryan as his miracle proof that life's greatest victories happen far from the stage. Fans who heard him sing after this period noticed a deeper, almost prayer-like quality in his voice. Eddie Levert's story is a reminder that behind every legend is a parent, and behind every chart-topping single is a human being who can be brought to his knees by the frailty of life. His devotion to Ryan showed that the true definition of soul is not only in music, it's in love that never lets go. Philip Bailey. Philip Bailey, the soaring falsetto voice of Earth, Wind and Fire, gave the world unforgettable songs like Reasons and Fantasy. His voice seemed to defy gravity, reaching heights few could touch. But while audiences marveled at his ability to elevate spirits, his own heart was weighed down by a tragedy close to home, an accident that forever altered his son Philip Jr.'s relationship with sound. On what should have been a joyful 4th of July celebration, fireworks misfired near Philip Jr. The explosion damaged his hearing in one ear, leaving him unable to experience music the way his family had for generations. Instead of crystal-clear notes, sounds now reached him distorted, as though echoing through a cave. For a child raised in a household filled with harmony, this was a devastating loss. Philip was crushed. Music was his lifeblood, the thread that connected him to both faith and family. To watch his son lose part of that inheritance felt unbearable. He spent thousands on advanced hearing aids, hired specialists, and even supported retraining programs designed to rewire the brain's ability to interpret sound. Nothing, however, could restore the effortless clarity his son once enjoyed. The pain pushed Philip toward advocacy. Aware that many parents shared his fear, he began funding awareness campaigns on firework safety, using his platform to stress the dangers often ignored during celebrations. It was a quieter contribution compared to his booming falsetto, but one that reflected his determination to turn personal heartbreak into prevention for others. Philip Jr. adapted in his own way. Unable to fully trust sound, he turned to visual art. His paintings carried the rhythm he could no longer hear, abstract colors shaped like melodies, canvases that vibrated with the energy of music lost. One piece, a shattered speaker with a bright red heart at its center, left his father speechless. Philip hung it in his studio as a daily reminder that even broken sound can create beauty. Though the world will always remember Philip Bailey for his ethereal falsetto, his story as a father reveals a deeper truth. Sometimes the most profound music isn't sung, it's found in resilience, love, and the courage to transform silence into another kind of art. Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson, the silken voice of Motown, made millions swoon with classics like Cruisin' and Tears of a Clown. His lyrics spoke of love and longing, and his smooth delivery seemed untouchable. But in private, Smokey faced a nightmare that lyrics could never soften the collapse of his son Trey on a basketball court. What looked like simple fatigue after a game turned into a medical emergency when Trey fell to the ground, eyes rolling back, clutching his stomach. Doctors diagnosed him with type 1 diabetes, a lifelong condition that required insulin pumps, strict monitoring, and constant vigilance. For Smokey, the guilt was immediate. He had been absent, often tied up in tours, recording sessions, and international travel. He blamed himself for missing signs, the unexplained tiredness, the thirst, the weight loss. "I was singing about tears," he once admitted, "while my son was slipping into real ones I didn't even see." That confession revealed the pain of a man who had always been the poet of romance, but now faced a father's harsh reality. Trey's childhood changed overnight. Sports were no longer safe, carefree days replaced with glucose checks and injections. Smokey, once known for dazzling stages, became his son's quiet supporter at home, learning how to calculate insulin doses and watching for dangerous drops in blood sugar. He often played soft ballads outside Trey's bedroom door, music no longer meant for fans, but as a lullaby of comfort for his boy. Smokey's artistry shifted after Trey's diagnosis. The soaring, flirtatious Motown sound gave way to slower ballads rich in intimacy and reflection. Fans who listened closely could feel the change. His songs no longer aimed to charm, but to reveal vulnerability. For Smokey, it wasn't about selling records anymore. It was about making sense of a world where even love couldn't protect a child from pain. Trey grew up with discipline shaped by his illness. Though he left sports behind, he found a new calling as a coach, teaching children with diabetes how to manage the disease with courage instead of fear. Smokey often said his son's strength humbled him more than any standing ovation ever could. For all his fame, his proudest achievement was learning to be present, not as Motown's golden boy, but as a father who finally heard the music of his child's resilience. Ronald Isley. Ronald Isley, the velvet-voiced frontman of the legendary Isley Brothers, gave the world timeless hits like Between the Sheets and For the Love of You. His music celebrated romance, desire, and intimacy, earning him the nickname Mr. Biggs in his later career. Yet while audiences saw a man who embodied confidence and smoothness at home, Ronald carried a wound few ever knew: his daughter Tranisha's tragic accident. At only 12 years old, Tranisha was playing hide-and-seek on a summer afternoon, climbing onto the roof of their home, a place she had often ventured before. But that day, her foot slipped. She fell 2 stories, landing hard, and when she woke in the hospital, she could no longer feel the lower half of her body. "Daddy, I can't feel anything," she told him, a phrase that haunted Ronald for the rest of his life. The accident shattered his world. No amount of fame, money, or influence could undo what had happened. Ronald threw everything he had into finding a cure. He paid for cutting-edge treatments, hired private medical teams, and even flew Tranisha across Europe searching for new rehabilitation programs. Despite the best care available, her spinal injury remained permanent. Ronald later admitted in private conversations that he would have traded every hit song for one chance to catch her before she fell. The accident changed Ronald as an artist. The smooth, sensual confidence that once defined his music gave way to sorrow-laden performances. When he sang ballads after the incident, there was a quiver beneath the velvet tone, as though every lyric carried the weight of loss. Fans who once saw him as the ultimate romantic began to notice a deeper ache in his voice, especially in live performances. It wasn't just entertainment anymore, it was confession. For Tranisha, life became a daily challenge, but she remained resilient. Surrounded by wheelchairs, therapy sessions, and constant medical care, she still found joy in small things, determined not to let her accident erase her spirit. And for Ronald, she became the center of his world, inspiring him to balance music with fatherhood. To audiences, Ronald Isley will always be a soul legend. But for those who know his story, his greatest ballad was not sung on stage. It was the silent vow he made to never stop loving the daughter who taught him the true meaning of endurance. Otis Redding. Otis Redding, often called the King of Soul, built a legacy on raw emotion and timeless classics like Try a Little Tenderness and Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. His voice carried the strength of gospel and the vulnerability of blues, captivating audiences worldwide. Yet beneath the soaring power of his performances was a father who carried a wound that never fully healed the accident that left his daughter Demetria scarred for life. Demetria was just 7 years old when tragedy struck. One afternoon in the family kitchen, she tripped and fell into a pot of boiling water. In seconds, her young body was covered in severe burns across her torso and arms. The screams, the smell of burning skin, the frantic rush to the hospital, Otis never forgot any of it. For days, he barely left her bedside unshaven and exhausted, transformed from a star commanding stages to a broken father praying for his child's survival. Demetria endured multiple skin graft surgeries, her body forever marked with scars and restricted movement. Activities most children take for granted, stretching, swimming, even playing freely, became impossible. Yet in her resilience, she found ways to smile, to paint, and even to make music in her own quiet way. Otis, however, carried the guilt, heavily convinced he should have prevented the accident. In the years that followed, Otis's music subtly changed. His earlier recordings had been bold, filled with fiery shouts and unrelenting energy. But after Demetria's accident, his songs carried a different weight. Listeners could hear sighs between notes, the softness of a man who had seen suffering up close. It wasn't bitterness, it was sorrow, quiet, but undeniable. In an interview, he once admitted, "I write pain because I live it." That line revealed what fans didn't know: each lyric was also a father's apology. Though remembered primarily for his meteoric career cut short by his own tragic death in 1967, Otis's private life reveals another side of his legacy. Beyond the stage lights and the roaring crowds, he was a man who measured his success not just in records sold, but in the strength of his daughter to live with scars and still smile. That story, though hidden, makes his soul music even more human and infinitely more profound. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack, the gravel-voiced soul troubadour behind Across 110th Street and If You Think You're Lonely, now lived a life marked by brilliance and controversy. His music was confessional, raw, and unapologetic. Yet the deepest confession of his life was not in a song, it was in the silent suffering of his son Truth, who was struck down by meningitis as a child. Meningitis is merciless. It begins like a fever and ends like a storm, stealing speech, memory, and even identity. For Bobby, the nightmare unfolded when Truth fell ill one evening and by the next morning no longer recognized his parents. The once playful boy who laughed and ran through the house became motionless in a hospital bed, his eyes distant, his words gone. Bobby was devastated. Fame meant nothing in the sterile light of the ICU. Desperate, he poured his wealth into treatments, Western medicine, Eastern therapies, meditation, even spiritual healing practices. He searched for cures across continents, but the truth remained: his son would never fully return to who he had been. Truth eventually relearned some basic language, but the disease left permanent damage. Bobby described every small victory, a word spoken, a smile returned as a miracle. This battle changed Bobby's music. His songs became more introspective, his voice heavy with pauses as if weighed down by unspoken grief. Listen closely to his later tracks, and you'll hear breaths between lyrics that sound like someone trying to hold back tears. He admitted in interviews that he was no longer writing for lovers or audiences, he was writing for his son, crafting music. Truth might one day understand, even if words failed. The Womack home became less about glamour and more about resilience. Each hug, each glance, each day together became precious. Truth's life was not measured by milestones the world expected, but by the love and patience surrounding him. Bobby, for all his flaws and controversies in public, proved himself in private as a father who refused to abandon his son's fight. And in that devotion, he revealed a side of soul music deeper than any chart-topping hit, the quiet, painful rhythm of unconditional love. Wilson Pickett. Wilson Pickett. The man whose raspy howl powered classics like In the Midnight Hour, and Mustang Sally was known for setting stages ablaze with raw energy. Yet away from the spotlight, his fiercest battle was not with fame addiction or the pressures of the industry. It was with a grief-stricken silence after his young son, Michael's tragic accident. Michael was only 9 years old when a speeding motorcycle hit him outside their home. The accident left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. For a father who sang with volcanic power, the moment was shattering. Wilson rushed to the scene, cradling his boy, but all he could feel was helplessness. From then on, nights once filled with rehearsals and raucous jam sessions became hushed vigils at his son's hospital bed. Pickett spared no expense in adapting to Michael's new life. He rebuilt the family home, installing an elevator, widening doorways, and restructuring hallways to make them wheelchair accessible. But money could not buy back the boy's ability to run, play, and dance. That truth gnawed at Wilson. On stage, he continued to scream, sweat, and electrify crowds, but his voice carried a new depth, a guttural anguish that fans often mistook for artistic passion. In reality, every roar was tinged with apology. After the accident, his music shifted. Songs that once burned with youthful swagger grew more profound, as though every lyric was directed not to fans, but to Michael. Listeners described his live performances as confessional, each howl a plea, each pause a sigh. Some even said that In the Midnight Hour took on a different weight, no longer just a love song, but a cry for something irretrievably lost. Wilson rarely spoke publicly about Michael's condition, preferring silence to interviews. But those who attended his later concerts often remarked that he no longer seemed like a man performing for applause. Instead, he looked like someone singing to survive, pouring out grief that had no other outlet. For all his fame as a soul powerhouse, Wilson Pickett's truest legacy may not be the hits that shook dance floors, but the love, guilt, and endurance of a father who never stopped singing for his son. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway's voice was unlike any other, smooth yet piercing, filled with gospel power and jazz sophistication. With songs like A Song for You and Someday We'll All Be Free, he became a symbol of vulnerability and hope in 1970s soul music. But behind his luminous artistry, Donny carried a private sorrow that few fans ever knew: the constant fear of losing his young daughter Donita to cystic fibrosis. Donita was just 4 years old when she was diagnosed with the disease. Her breathing grew labored, punctuated by coughing fits that kept the entire family awake at night. For Donny, each sound was unbearable, as though his child's lungs were playing a sorrowful tune he couldn't rewrite. Determined to protect her, he purchased industrial-strength air purifiers for their Chicago home and even moved the family closer to a hospital for quicker access to treatment. Still, cystic fibrosis is relentless. Donita lived with oxygen machines, endless medical routines, and strict diets. Donny transformed his role from entertainer to caretaker, memorizing every prescription, watching her every breath. One of the most heartbreaking moments came when he sang "You Are My Sunshine" to her during a hospital stay. It wasn't just a lullaby, it was a plea, a confession that she was the light keeping him alive. Donny's career reflected this pain. His compositions grew more somber, his piano chords heavier, his lyrics more fragile. Songs like Someday We'll All Be Free resonated not only as an anthem for social change, but also as a father's whispered hope for his daughter's survival. Those who listened closely could feel it. His art was no longer just about reaching audiences, it was about holding on to his child through melody. Donita, despite her illness, inherited her father's love for music. She sang gospel and studied piano later, saying that her father's voice didn't just save others, it saved her spirit. For Donny, this resilience gave him purpose even as his own struggles with mental health grew heavier. Though his life ended tragically in 1979, the love he poured into Donita's survival remains part of his legacy. Donny Hathaway's music touched the world, but his greatest song was sung quietly in a hospital room to a daughter fighting for every breath. Jeffrey Osborne. Jeffrey Osborne, the silky-voiced balladeer known for On the Wings of Love and Love Ballad, spent decades serenading the world with songs about joy, unity, and romance. His voice was a warm embrace offering comfort to millions. But away from the spotlight, Osborne endured a heartbreak that reshaped his life and artistry. His son Dawn's battle with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a cruel disease that slowly robs the body of its strength. Dawn was diagnosed as a child. At first, it appeared as clumsiness, frequent falls, and difficulty climbing stairs. Soon, the reality set in. His muscles were deteriorating, and there was no cure. Jeffrey, who had always commanded stages with boundless energy, now found himself learning medical jargon, assisting with wheelchairs, and confronting a condition that progressed no matter how much money or love he poured into treatment. Osborne's career came to a halt. Tours were canceled, contracts set aside as he devoted his time and savings to his son's care. He sought specialists around the world, explored experimental therapies, and remodeled his home to accommodate Dawn's growing needs. Nights once spent under stage lights were replaced with long hours pushing wheelchairs through hospital corridors, praying for breakthroughs that never came. Despite his body weakening, Dawn found his own way to connect with music. Using one functional hand, he created beats and edited vocal tracks, carving out a creative identity that inspired everyone around him. Jeffrey often said it was his son, not his career, that taught him the true meaning of strength. Through Dawn's persistence, he learned that resilience is not measured in muscle, but in spirit. This struggle reshaped Jeffrey's artistry. His later songs abandoned polished perfection for raw honesty, infused with the weight of sleepless nights and a father's desperate love. Audiences began to notice the difference. Less theatricality, more confessional intimacy. His voice, already smooth now, carried cracks that made it human in the truest sense. Though celebrated worldwide as a soul singer, Jeffrey Osborne's greatest legacy may not be the songs that topped charts, but the devotion he showed to his son. Through Dawn's fight, he discovered that love isn't measured by applause, but by the quiet strength of never giving up. Charlie Wilson. Charlie Wilson, the powerhouse voice behind the Gap Band, and later solo hits like There Goes My Baby, has lived a life of triumphs and trials. Rising from funk royalty to gospel-inspired R&B stardom, he became known for resilience after overcoming addiction and illness. Yet behind his celebrated comeback was a personal heartbreak that rarely made headlines: his adopted daughter Ila's battle with Rett syndrome. Rett syndrome is a rare neurological disorder that robs children of speech mobility and independence, often after years of normal development. For Charlie, watching Ila gradually lose her ability to talk, walk, and even use her hands was devastating. The man whose music brought joy to millions could only sit helplessly as his daughter drifted further into silence. He often spoke of nights when he performed sold-out shows, dazzling fans with his trademark energy, only to break down backstage thinking of Ila drawing circles on a piece of paper, the only way she could still communicate. His booming voice, which electrified arenas, became a whisper at home as he prayed over her bedside, wishing she could recognize him again. Charlie transformed his grief into action. He donated royalties from some of his biggest hits to research foundations for Rett syndrome, and even started interactive music therapy projects designed for children with disabilities. His later songs, though still powerful, carried a depth of sadness and reflection that fans noticed, proof that he was no longer just singing about romance, but about survival, love, and endurance. Though Ila's condition limited her abilities, she inspired her father's advocacy and deepened his artistry. For Charlie Wilson, the true measure of his success was not chart-topping singles, but standing as a father who turned heartbreak into hope for families like his own. Freddie Jackson. Freddie Jackson, the velvety crooner of the 1980s, became synonymous with romance through hits like You Are My Lady and Rock Me Tonight. His voice defined quiet storm R&B laced with intimacy and elegance. But while fans swooned to his ballads, Freddie carried a private anguish his daughter Jasmine's battle with a brain tumor. Jasmine was only 8 when the diagnosis came. One day, she was lively and playful. The next, doctors were telling Freddie she needed immediate surgery. The procedure saved her life but left her partially paralyzed on one side of her body. For Freddie, it was as if time froze, his child's laughter replaced by wheelchairs, therapy sessions, and the constant fear of relapse. He transformed his home into a rehabilitation center. Days once filled with rehearsals became hours spent practicing hand movements and encouraging Jasmine through painful therapy. Some days she progressed. Other days she sat silently frustrated by her limitations. Freddie, who had sung to millions, now found his most important audience in one little girl. Despite the challenges, Jasmine's spirit never dimmed. She found her own voice in writing, documenting her journey through journals and recordings. Freddie often described her as a warrior, not because she beat her illness, but because she never surrendered to despair. His music shifted as well. The smooth, seductive ballads of his early career gave way to slower, more reflective songs. Listeners noted the vulnerability in his later albums, as though every lyric was drawn from sleepless nights spent at his daughter's bedside. Freddie Jackson may be remembered as a romantic crooner, but his truest love story was the devotion he gave to Jasmine. In choosing fatherhood over fame, he revealed that the quietest sacrifices often leave the loudest legacies. Though these 21 Black R&B legends stood beneath bright lights and filled the world with unforgettable music, their most powerful stories unfolded in silence, facing their children's disabilities with courage, guilt, sacrifice, and love. Behind every hit was a hidden battle, one that proved legends are not only made on stage, but in the quiet strength of parenthood. Their music carried pain the public never knew yet, also resilience that defined their humanity. Do you believe their greatest legacy lies in the records they left behind, or in the unspoken devotion they showed at home? Subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence.